As a subscriber to my weekly newsletter, you should be completely familiar with the approach that you see me drawing right now, because you would have gone through my mini course from stickmen to cartoons, and so you'll know what's going on. You'll know that it's incredibly important when you want to use a stickman as the beginning of any cartoon character to have two things. First is the shoulder girdle, and the second is the hip girdle. The next most important thing, of course, is the 6 joints that help you to move something. So these strategic joints of shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then hip, knee, and ankle are the joints that are most important when it comes to moving your stickman around. And that's all very well, but what happens if you want to draw a stickman in 3/4 profile? Or perhaps even in full profile? You might even be wondering, what do those terms mean? That's what we're going to cover today. Now, this is a stick figure drawn in 3/4 profile, and the easiest way to understand what the difference is between this and the basic stickman is to look at them side by side. So our basic stickman, we're seeing him from the front on, and if he had a face, we would see both his eyes, his nose, his mouth like that, and his ears on the sides of his face. We also see his shoulder girdle from the front on and the hip girdle from the front on. And although he's standing with his feet splayed, that's just one small point of difference. With the 3/4 profile, we can see immediately that we're looking at him from an angle. Instead of looking straight at his face, we see that we're looking at his face turned slightly to the side. We're looking at him from the slight side on. We can see with his shoulders, they're at a slight angle as well, as are his hips. And the distance between his spine and this shoulder is slightly larger than his spine and the far shoulder. Similarly, the distance between his spine and this hip is slightly larger than the distance between this spine and the far hip. And of course, it's not that suddenly his spine has shifted over. It's just the effect of perspective when we're not looking at him directly face on. And so as soon as you want to get a little bit of extra movement and motion into your stick figures, you'll want to put them at an angle to the viewer, because that's a much more dynamic pose to be working in. And the mechanics of drawing him are very similar to what they were before. We just make this distance a little longer, make this distance a little longer, and then we come along and put in our other joints just as we always do. And of course, we need to make his feet point in the direction that he's facing. Well, we don't have to, but at the moment that's what seems to work best for this particular pose, and we're keeping it simple. So that is a 3/4 profile. And now it's time to look at the full profile, or what's sometimes known as the side profile. And once again, the best way to see the differences between this and the face-on stickman are to compare them side by side. So in our face-on stickman, once again, we see both of his eyes, we see his nose, we see his mouth, we can see both ears. More importantly, from a body point of view, we can see the symmetry of his body. We can see both his shoulders, we can see both his hip joints, we can see both his arms and his legs. Now when it comes to the side profile or full profile, we can only see one eye. We can see his nose, but we can see it from the side. We can see half of his mouth. We can see one ear. Most importantly, from the body's point of view, are the effects on what we can see of his body. Now remember, his body still remains pretty much symmetrical in real life, but what we can see of it changes. We can just see the end of his shoulder girdle and the one shoulder joint which is closest to us. Similarly with his hips, we see the end of the hip girdle and the one hip joint which is closest to us. I've chosen to draw in 2 arms and 2 legs so that you can see how it looks having the limbs doing different things. So you still get a sense that he's got all his limbs, but we're only seeing them from the side. However, take a look at this. If I just get rid of that arm and get rid of that leg, if he was standing with his arms by his sides and his legs side by side, this is pretty much what you would see of him. Let me draw this arm in like this. You would see an arm like that, like that, like that. His arm's kind of at his side, or you could even draw it straight down his side. Then that looks even stranger because you can hardly see his arm. But for illustration purposes, it makes much more sense to see how he looks with his two limbs, because then you can picture it. Now to end off, we'll have all three of our stick men side by side so that we have comparison. Here we have our face-on stick man, as symmetrical as any person can be, with both shoulder joints and both hip joints completely visible, both eyes, both ears, nose and mouth. Then we move to our three-quarter profile, and here we can see that we have this appearance of the distance between the spine and this joint being slightly longer than on the other side, the further side, and similarly with the hip, this distance appearing to be longer than it is on the other side. And this is simply the effect of perspective. When a person is turned slightly at an angle to the viewer, you get what is called foreshortening, where the proportions of the body appear to change. Then when you have a full profile, you get the full effects of foreshortening, which are that you can only see one joint, the joint that's closest to you, of both the shoulders and the hips. And if the body were in a perfectly symmetrical pose, we wouldn't see both the arms and both the legs. But for the purposes of visualization and illustration, I have put in 2 arms and 2 legs with slightly different poses. And so there you have it. Did you like this video? If you did, please share it with all of your friends and give it a like on YouTube. And if you'd like even more tips and things that I only share on email, head on over to my website www.alisonbeere.com and sign up for email updates. Keep drawing, and I'll see you next time.